Many first responders can see hundreds of traumatic events over the course of an average career.
It's possible that 30% of first responders are suffering right now from PTS.
It doesn't matter how big and strong you are. Everybody and anybody can suffer from PTSD.
I'm no longer on the job because my brain couldn't take anymore.
Police officers are much more likely to die by their own hands than to die in the line of duty.
PTSD is real. Cumulative trauma is real, and we need to deal with it.
Everyone has a breaking point. In law enforcement first response, we're constantly bombarded with these calls for service that over time is going to change you as a person.
In one shift, one day, they can see more trauma, loss, death, and destruction than a civilian will encounter in their whole lifetime.
It is not normal that someone should pull burnt children out of a building. That's not normal. We're not wired for that biologically.
I was the first officer on the scene, walked through the door, 20 feet away was a little girl, 4 years old, shot in the eye. That just bothered me, just that picture alone. I can picture it today like it was yesterday.
There's several calls that I have in my past that I went to that still stick with me to today and I still have nightmares about. I got called to a car accident. It was the day after Christmas. And I went to this call and I looked down and here's this guy that I know and he got ejected from the vehicle and the car landed on him and he passed. But this call just affected me differently because it was somebody I knew. Just to see him lose his life and his family lose him just affected me. It really made things real. It was like the first time I realized that could be me. Just seeing Dan laying there and knowing that his family will never be the same.
If you're working a 12-hour shift, you're on your feet the whole time. You don't have time to eat. You don't have time to pee. You are not a person when you're on shift. You show up and you run from room to room. You could be doing anything. You could be holding wounds closed. You could have 4 traumas all at the same time and you're literally wading through blood on the floor, trying not to fall on your butt, whilst you have 3 different doctors screaming at you to do things that you can't do because you're sitting there doing something important.
Chase Finch, 4 months old, sitting in a car seat on top of a stove, burning. I'll never forget his name. I'll never forget his picture, what he looks like.
I took a call one time of a kid who found his mom had passed away, and the kid was like 11 or 12. I just heard his voice and so excited that he's going to save his mom's life and he's going to go find the neighbor and do this to help get CPR started or whatnot. And then knowing that when we got there, the mom was already deceased, just kind of crushed me. And that was the one point in my career where I kind of thought, I don't know that I can come back from this.
All of a sudden, the male takes the knife and comes up and starts coming down the stairs. We all fired our weapon. I didn't know if he'd been hit. I didn't know who had been hit, what happened. Next thing I know, he's at the bottom of the stairs, and I don't see any blood. I don't see any injuries. But I can see he's got the butcher knife still clenched in his right hand. And we're telling him, drop the knife, drop the knife. And he starts to come back up with the knife. We both fired our weapons, and he was killed instantly. I mean, he had devastating wounds. His eye was gone. I mean, I knew at that point he had been hit. There was blood everywhere. And it was that moment that forever changed my life.
So there are a few incidents as an officer that still stay with me. And it was a 1-month-old baby. And she'd accidentally been suffocated by her mother. Her mother had woken up in the middle of the night to nurse her in her bed, and the mom had fallen asleep and rolled over on top of the baby and suffocated her.
I had an inmate who hung himself. I was doing my round, saw him hanging like anyone else. I rushed in, cut him down. Performed CPR, saved his life. 2 weeks later, I was sued by him and his family.
And there were 4 kids that were on the train tracks playing. And the train was coming through at 65 miles an hour. 2 were hit by the train. So we were giving CPR to the 6-year-old child and giving breaths, and the breaths were coming out of the back of his head. And there's blood everywhere, and I'll never forget it because the parents were yelling, screaming at our heads, saying, "Please save my son, please save my son." So whenever I see a train flying by, I think of that child and what happened that day. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Shit.
By far the worst call I ever had was, it was a suicide in a hotel, room 225 at the Super 8 Hotel, and came as a suicide attempt. The cleaning lady seen somebody. I was first one through the door, and I remember seeing a blonde hanging from her jeans, and when I grabbed the noose to see her, it was my wife, mother of my children, and that's by far the worst call I've had.
One of the first calls that I ever had at 18 years of age when I joined this job was a guy who had put a baby in a microwave because it just wouldn't stop crying.
Columbine was just the most surprising thing in the world, and nobody knew what to do. Nobody had trained for this type of situation. When we made entry into the place, it really looked like a war zone. A lot of destruction, glass shot out in the front as we went in, holes in the walls, pipes still sticking in the wall, pipe bombs that only partially exploded, and an enormous amount of backpacks, kids' backpacks laying everywhere.
I remember watching a guy burn to death in his car, and I was unable to get him out of the car. And I watched him burn to death as he was pleading with me to get him out. And I was unable to do it. It was one of the most horrible moments of my life. And it was more than 30 years ago.
At first, I didn't think he even got me. I thought he missed. But then I realized there was some blood on my face, and yeah, he got me 9 times. Had a punctured lung, pierced bowel, spent about 5 days in the hospital, a couple days in ICU, surgery and chest tube later, and finally got out of the hospital and recovered for about 2 months. Even though my career was less than a year long, I definitely came out with some PTSD, for sure.
As I was going over the Triborough Bridge, I looked down to my left, and you could just see the smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center area. I could plainly see it was absent one tower. You could still see the one tower standing. I get to my office, we rally up, we all meet up, and we're all sitting there and we're looking out the window, and then the next thing you know, we see the second tower fall. And that is the time when the full weight of what happened hit me. One of the things I remember, it's a vivid thought, I remember being up at the Staten Island landfill, and there was a piece of an I-beam that came through, and when we turned it over, there was a torso in between the I-beam, encased inside. When I read some of these names and the names come up for people that I know, my stomach just does total flip-flops. It's not butterflies, it's like being hit in the stomach.
Sleep deprivation from this job, the residual effects of everything added together, you need an outlet to help you physically as well as mentally. And I think golf does that.
Being out on a golf course, it's very relaxing. Most of our golf courses have trees, they have creeks, they have different waterways. Sand traps, obviously, I'm very good at those. Makes me feel like I'm on a beach.
Being on the golf course is about being out in nature, and you're away from the stresses of a bad call that you might have ran the shift before or a couple days before.
The quietness of most golf courses, I mean, that's the thing. You don't hear all the noise. There are definitely life lessons in golf because you're going to hit it in the woods. And there's days in life where I've hit it in the woods. In my marriage, being a father of 3 kids, and you've got to take your penalty, take the drop. To me, those lessons carry over into life. And it also teaches you that sometimes the little things aren't as important. Like you get upset when you hit it in the sand trap, or you get upset when your kids are bad at school. You just refocus them and yourself, and you move on. You deal with it and you move on to the next shot or the next day.
The foundation is trying to address the PTSD, residual effect, cumulative effect issues, one golf swing at a time.
There's different types of stress that first responders deal with. Critical incident stress from a traumatic event is one of them, but there is something called cumulative stress. And it may not even be like big events, but repeated events over time, that stress builds up and you have that cumulative stress. So when people talk about PTSD, sometimes it's not one event that pushed them over the edge. It's 20 years of responding to these bad calls.
There can be a tendency to push on and suffer in silence in this community, but if you do that, then the problem will often build and get much worse. Cumulative effect of trauma is just over time going to pile up and create a much bigger problem.
They start early on in their career, they start getting their first PEDS death, they start looking and seeing more vehicle accidents, fatalities, structure fires, and it just builds on people.
PTSD, it really evolves from not being able to process what you saw, the pain and the suffering, and there's just no way for your brain to understand exactly where to go with that.
Police officers, fire, EMS, whoever deals with crises on a regular basis, they're gonna have that trauma buildup.
When that car accident happens, or when the tones get dropped even to go to that, we automatically have a release of chemicals in our body causing a parasympathetic overdrive. When that occurs, our brain ends up actually getting flooded with about 30 different chemicals. So it takes about 30 hours for those chemicals to metabolize in your body from that one incident.
You don't even have time to physically allow yourself to just come down from everything that releases in the brain when you're experiencing something like that. You may go from one call to the next, and then it all piles and you have no processing time.
I think post-traumatic stress injury occurs much more frequently from cumulative events than one singular event.
With first responders, you're literally seeing death, loss, destruction every single day for a career, a 20, 30-year career. So it's the cumulative stress with first responders that I think is the most damaging.
While one event may not be breaking to someone, these little moments and these traumatic experiences over time add up.
I was on the job 17 years and I responded to a drowning. Something about that one was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And in the days that followed, it blew up my little box of traumas, and every traumatic call I had ever been to was racing through my head.
It's not so much the big blast of moments that affect your well-being. It's that day-to-day hardship, constantly seeing death, constantly giving death announcements to mothers, constantly dealing with rape victims and child abuse. Those are what really rip your soul out.
All the cumulative traumatic events that happened in my career, it was changing me as a person. And if I didn't do something quick, I was going to commit suicide. I was going to be divorced, be an alcoholic, and I didn't want to go down that path. I told myself I would never be that guy.
When I say that we have an emotional container inside of us, and that container, when it gets full, that container's full.
It's almost like a jar. When we start our career, it's almost like an empty jar. There's a few things in there from our childhood, from when we're younger, and this jar just keeps filling up as we're exposed to traumatic incidents. And if we don't talk about it, we don't address it, that jar is going to eventually overflow.
This cumulative stress just is there. And because we're not dealing with it, it just keeps building, and that closet can only hold so much of it. And eventually it's going to come out.
The way I managed that trauma is I envisioned the old steel filing cabinets that you would have in the office, and I would stick all my calls in that filing cabinet in specific folders. Towards the end of my career, the files were all over the floor, there was no organization, it was just totally discombobulated.
So you go to a traumatic event and you have a chain on your neck, and then each traumatic event you go to after that, it's like adding another link and another link, but then over time, the chain becomes so heavy that officers get dragged down.
If you don't do things, seek out therapy, seek out help, and recognize the changes that are happening to you, you're going to go down a path that you can't come back from.
I realized that my emotional bowl was full a couple of years before I retired. When your emotional bowl is full, if you can't figure out a way to dump it, it can destroy you.
So there's something extremely therapeutic about being on the beach, out in the sun, in the salt water, connecting with nature.
The ocean reminds you how small you are. It's a very humbling, but a very peaceful, wonderful experience. You can take that time to reflect.
It just takes over your entire brain. You literally can't think about anything else because you're in the middle of the ocean.
There have been a lot of studies on surf therapy, and what they found was that it's particularly effective in the first responder community. Surfing is very beneficial when treating PTSD, and it gives them hope. And that's one of the things we aim to measure when we take people out there.
And I know us cops and other first responders, we don't like to hear the word therapy because, you know, we're all big, strong individuals, but this really is therapy in a different kind of way.
To just let it all go and not have any stress or any worries because you're just so focused on what you have to do in that moment and try to catch some waves.
I think connecting with nature is therapeutic, and there's just something that's so pure and organic about being in nature and recentering yourself and really being mindful and knowing what's important in life and what's not, and providing a little bit of perspective.
I was in denial. I really was in denial with the symptoms that I was experiencing. I said, I'll get over it, I'll get over it, I'm okay. I wasn't okay.
First responders have a lot of symptoms in common, including difficulties with sleep, chronic hypervigilance, sometimes a startle response if someone comes up behind them.
There are incidents in my mind that I try to push aside, but are as vivid to me today as they were years and years ago.
They tend to relive the incident or the experiences, and they can have reoccurring and invasive thoughts, memories, feelings.
I was displaying all sorts of symptomology as far as not sleeping. I was distancing myself from my family. When I was home, I wasn't there. I was just checked out.
I didn't want to talk to people. I didn't want people to bring this up. I didn't want them to ask me about it.
I was irritable. I didn't have good cognitive functioning. My memory was poor. My emotions were all over the place, up and down.
I went to the emergency room 7 times in 9 days thinking I was having a heart attack at 24 years old. Every time they would tell me you're having a panic attack, you're having anxiety issues.
Everybody's different and not everybody has the same symptoms. So like for me, my memory is completely shot. There's whole periods of my life that I remember nothing from.
I would get lost going to my appointments. I would forget the garage combination to my door. And when I knew I needed more help was when I couldn't remember my kids' names.
It's like being in a pitch black room with no walls, no windows, no door, and you just feeling your way through.
It was like being trapped in a movie theater. You know, with my eyes taped open, the volume's turned all the way up, and the screen is as bright as it's gonna get, and I can't leave and I can't move, and I'm just stuck.
It's like I'm in a well, I can't see the bottom, I can't see the top. I'm falling, but I got no idea where I'm going.
The most outward portrayed symptom I had was anger. Come to find out, that's pretty common with men. A lot of male first responders, it's anger because you're so confused as to what you're actually feeling and that you're not able to process and that you're constantly juggling this fight or flight, that a lot of it comes out as anger.
I was like a different person. I was mean, I was sarcastic. I wasn't the best guy out on the street. I was crabby, I was just not me.
With that anger comes a whole slew of other things. And for me, I had massive hypervigilance where I couldn't walk into a restaurant or any sort of other public building without head counting everyone that was in there, needing to know where the exits were. And if it was somewhere where I was sitting with my back against the wall or at least the back of the store or the restaurant and looking at the exit.
Even to this day, if we're in a restaurant, always facing the door, always having an exit plan.
For years, I have not gone to a movie with my wife. Sitting in an open theater with the lights down low to the point to where I barely see what's in your hand freaks me out. I can't tolerate that. I can't deal with that.
I didn't have good sleep. I was waking up every few hours in a panic, in like almost a panic attack, getting out of bed and shaking and just saying, oh my God, something's wrong, something's not right.
And I'd wake up screaming, and I'd wake up soaking wet, and I flipped myself out of bed a couple times, landed on the floor.
I remember just constant nightmares. But I also remember that I wasn't able to go to sleep. I didn't want to go to sleep because I didn't want these nightmares.
Night terrors where I would wake up thinking that I was still in the dream and somebody was chasing me to kill me, and I'd go to grab my service revolver.
Flashbacks, nightmares, insomnia, depression, those are common symptoms that I see for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Most first responders and medical providers, we are many times used to seeing trauma and horrible things, and we have our own way of coping. And sometimes those coping skills are healthy, and sometimes those coping skills are not healthy.
I've seen officers that have turned to alcohol, drugs. They deal with the trauma in destructive ways.
The first things that they'll do is go to unhealthy coping mechanisms, those things that make you feel good. Shopping, gambling, drugs, alcohol.
Mine was gambling, something totally out of the blue. My partner's, his was sexual. So an addiction can be anything.
One of the things we like to do is we like to go out and spend money and just get that dopamine hit. We like to have the newest truck that comes out. We want the boat. We want the four-wheelers.
My primary way of coping with PTS was alcohol.
In the first responder culture, going out for drinks, going out for choir practice after a shift is something that's culturally normal, and it's often used as a way to cope. It can work in the short term, but it often really does damage in the long term.
Alcohol works. It's horrible. It's destructive and all those other things, but the problem is that when you're in it, it works. It shuts everything down.
One of the hardest, most darkest areas of my life was when I got addicted to hydrocodone. I was popping pills daily and drinking daily.
If I was drinking or I was high, I wasn't angry. I didn't want to be angry. I knew I didn't want to be angry.
When my trauma was coming up a lot, when I was dealing with the impact of that trauma and having thoughts about taking my own life, because it was that bad, I would drink over the top of it. And that became a substantial issue, a substantial complication on top of my trauma.
We don't talk about these things. We joke about them. And it's gallows humor, but that's a survival technique where we literally detach ourselves from these horrific incidents and just joke about it and pretend like it doesn't affect us.
If you deal with human remains and you deal with injuries and you deal with body recovery, it's very, very traumatizing. In those high stress, high intensity moments when you really are suffering, what comes out of our mouths is not always appropriate.
We had another person commit suicide, and she did it in a car, and she had a bottle of wine with her. And we have a local high school here, Regina, and rigor mortis had set in. So they couldn't get the wine bottle out of her hand, so he's like, says, must be from Regina. Yep, she can't get the wine out of her hand, and we're laughing about it. And the hardest part was, it was a detached garage, windows were open, family heard everything.
That dark humor that society would not really understand is something that we lean on as a way of coping to get through those difficult times.
You find a way to deal with it. You find a way to deal with these critical incidents. And if it's dark humor, fine. If it's crying, fine. But it still eats away at you.
All of these enabling behaviors make the symptoms much, much worse. And they end up causing much more damage, not only to you mentally, physically, but to our loved ones.
Unhealthy coping is really how I coped with it, and none of it helped it. None of it helped it. It masked it, it pushed it off to the side, it made it worse. It got it to its boiling point several times.
Art therapy gives you a safe space so you can honestly look inside and explore yourself and then express what you feel without being judged. And when you feel those things, begin to ask yourself, where do I connect those feelings with? And really begin to heal from the wounds that we carry because of things we've experienced or seen.
You're using art as like a language, and you're putting it on paper, and as you're doing it, there's certain things inside of you that are unfolding and things that from your past that pop up.
Men and women who went through trauma can stop and begin to use art to begin to see themselves differently in how they feel, how it's okay to feel, it's okay to express. It's okay to let those emotions out.
Art therapy is probably one of the few therapies that a couple can participate in together. Each of you is going to learn about some difficult things that you've been struggling with, and being able to sit next to your partner and be there with them through that is a special thing.
PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is what psychologists use to make a diagnosis. It's what's in our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
The Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is called the DSM, is where the post-traumatic stress disorder criteria lives. That was created years ago by some old farts who decided what comes up with the diagnostic criteria.
A number of people have advocated, including myself, for switching the term to post-traumatic stress injury because we now understand, based on neuroscience-informed innovation, that when we're exposed to stress, there's a biological injury that occurs. And I think that's been the missing piece.
Injury means it's biologic, it's measurable, and you can treat it using biological means.
Calling it PTSI will also reduce the stigma if we see it as partly a biological injury.
However, I don't think the old farts for the DSM are going to change that at this moment.
The brain, when it's subjected to chronic stress or acutely stressful or traumatic incidents, it changes, it alters, and it becomes locked in fight or flight.
Under stress, your brain goes to the amygdala, which I call the Incredible Hulk, which is just throwing punches. It doesn't matter who they're punching, right? Just survive.
Because the amygdala overrides your neocortex, or the new part of the brain. So that controls, if amygdala isn't happy, nobody's happy.
The amygdala is also where anxiety lives, in those reverberating circuits of, if only I'd done something different, my buddy would still be alive. If only I'd done something different, if only I'd done something different.
You can't process information if your brain isn't working correctly. You can't learn skills if your brain isn't working correctly. You can't become functional if your brain's not working correctly.
One of the things I want to emphasize is PTSD is not an emotional problem. It's not a weakness of character. It is a biological problem. It is damage in the brain. And that's where the symptoms come from. That's where the sleep problems come from and the irritability problems come from.
When somebody's experiencing something like post-traumatic stress injury, the brain gets out of balance. The brain doesn't properly produce the right dopamine, serotonin, and other feel-good chemicals in the brain, and that causes this imbalance that begins to happen. And when we have an imbalanced brain, symptoms, mental health symptoms arise.
There is a degenerative, destructive process that's caused by certain areas of the brain becoming overactive and releasing inflammatory chemicals that disrupt brain function, things that destroy circuits, things that break down synapses, things that literally kill neurons.
So we have multiple chemicals involved, the norepinephrine, corticosteroid, cortisol, and all these what we consider to be the negative chemicals, the things that make us anxious, the things that make us depressed, the things that make us angry. Well, it's a chemical reaction. It's not something wrong with you per se.
The brain can create sort of an overactivity response. Cells become more active and they're releasing what's called glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that stimulates the brain, but it's also a toxic chemical.
When the bell goes off, your body doesn't know whether it's going to fight a saber-toothed tiger or it's going on an alarm. And a lot of the alarms we go on are not critical. So your body gets ramped up for that. We don't necessarily feel that or know that we're being stressed, but our body releases those chemicals to enable us to fight that saber-toothed tiger. And then when we don't, now we have all these chemicals in our body that are poisonous to the body.
That rush of adrenaline is good when you're doing it on the job, but it wears on you. And you don't realize it, and you go decades into this career, and it's affected you mentally, it's affected you physically. You're not turning it off. In some cases, even mine, you're having, like early cardiac problems because of this constant adrenaline. It's fun when it's happening. It's fun when you're young, running and gunning when you're in your 20s and 30s, but when you get older, it's takes its toll.
PTSD sets off this whole mess of chemicals being released and parts of the brain that are part of the default mode network becoming overactive, which results in the frontal cortex, our thinking cortex, not being able to work as well, getting shut down. And that leads to degenerative changes in brain cells. For example, the dendrites, which are the little tree-like things on neurons, start to break down. Instead of being fluffy like a willow tree, they kind of look like a pruned rose bush in the winter. And you lose synapses. And so like looking at these really fine fibers, you see these little mushroom bubbles coming off the sides of the fibers. Those are synapses. And in the normal brain, there's a whole mess of them. But in PTSD, there is a loss of synapses. And so you see very few of these little things. The hippocampus, the part of the brain involved in learning and memory, shrinks, gets smaller. And that's a degenerative change. Now, the good news is that with treatment, the hippocampus can enlarge again, that this degenerative change is in fact reversible.
Neurostimulation involves different kinds of energy being introduced to the brain. There's photobiomodulation, that's the use of near-infrared. It's found to be extremely effective for regenerating the brain and rehabbing the brain. Pulsed electromagnetic stimulation, that has also been shown to reduce inflammation, increase blood flow. It's another type of neurostimulation. Transcranial direct current stimulation. This is where electrodes are placed directly on the skin and small pulses of electricity are actually passed through the brain. TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now that's FDA approved for the treatment of depression.
For anybody that's watching that knows what a PHQ-9 scale is, it's just a way to measure your depression level. 27 is the worst score that you can have and 0 is the best, obviously. When I started TMS, my score was at 24. When I finished, it was at 6.
Neurostimulation treatment is an incredible treatment. When I have first responder clients who need help and need help now, I'm able to sit down with them and tell them about this treatment, tell them what their map says, tell them what protocol we're going to be using, and provide a guide of somewhere between 8 and 10 sessions when they're going to start feeling relief from their symptoms.
It changed everything. Like I had 0 anxiety when I was done. My hypervigilance was way, way down.
It puts you in a place where you can reclaim your life. And it's really special when you see somebody get to a place where they've been in enormous amounts of pain for years, and then they find that peace. It's remarkable.
Everybody thinks that nobody else is feeling this. There's something wrong with me because I'm feeling this. And the reality is that everybody's feeling it, but nobody wants to admit it.
You need to address the situation at hand, but that stigma that we have in the police department, will help everybody, but we're the last ones to seek help.
Back when I started law enforcement, nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about expressing your feelings. You're all supposed to keep that all on the inside.
So the stigmas are a huge hurdle to being able to get them connected to help.
We as first responders have this thing called pride. We're great individuals when it comes to helping someone else. We are the worst in helping ourselves.
So it's hard for somebody in the first responder world, whether it's police, fire, EMS, to ask for help because that's not part of our wheelhouse. We're the ones giving help. We're not the ones asking for help.
Firefighters and cops are the most stubborn people in the world. They are. And because of that, we refuse to accept that we need help.
And I didn't want anyone to know how I felt because I thought that was weakness. I thought that was shameful.
Any responder who's ever been in any branch knows the power of the grapevine and that the rumor mill runs fast, and we are all terrified of being voted off the island, of being shamed, of being viewed as less than, of being doubted in our capacity. That is probably one of the biggest fears that prevents responders from reaching out for help is, what will my coworkers think of me?
The fear of being stigmatized by your peers, huge among us.
I said, you know what, I can't be that weak link in the chain. I'm the tough guy, as they teach you in the academy. You know, show no emotion. You're the guy. You're the boss. Suck it up.
Literally have been told, "Suck it up, Buttercup," at least 2 or 3 dozen times in my career.
I was one of those people that believed that you had to suck it up, Buttercup. You know, you got to deal with it. You're the police. You may have to, you may get shot at someday, or you may have to fight on the street. You're too tough for this, and you can't show weakness.
The old school way of thinking is that you just need to bury that stuff down. If you can't handle it, you shouldn't be a cop.
I've even had family members say, "Isn't that what you signed up for?" And I've never sat through a police interview and heard someone say that they want to be a cop to go see a dead kid.
You're going to see bad things, but you got to pull your boots up and you got to get through this. And you really just got to suck it up. It's the job. And it is. The trauma is you're going to see bad things. What isn't is allowing these to manifest and remain with you for years and decades.
I think the biggest barrier for first responders is that they're afraid of being pulled out of their tribe and sidelined.
So is it possible, I don't go get help because I'm worried about my future and either promotional opportunities or other service opportunities within my agency?
People are scared to lose their assignment. They're scared they'll get it put behind a desk, scared to lose their gun, scared to lose their job, their financial security.
And that's always on the back of the mind of every officer. If I do say some of the symptoms that I have or some of the problems that I'm experiencing, I might get fired. I may not get promoted. It's going to affect my career. And that happens a lot in the police departments.
There are so many barriers to treatment for our first responders.
Some insurance companies don't offer mental health counseling. You have to pay out of pocket for that.
You sometimes have to jump through some hoops to get insurance to cover things. And a lot of programs that are really good don't take all insurances.
The financial burden for having to pay for that kind of treatment out of your own pocket is definitely a big hindrance on people.
We're seeing people struggle with that issue, is that, oh yeah, I need help, but I can't afford the hourly pay of the counselor. And so then they say, well, I'll try to do this on my own. Or they go on the internet and try to solve their issues. And everyone tries to be a doctor then. And it's just not working.
Why are our suicide numbers so high? Because people can't get to the care that they need and they can't get the resources that they need.
But if you get into the rural areas, there's just no resources there to be had in the first place. And especially when we're talking about mental health type injuries.
That's why there's people out there that are fighting hard to expose what's available. Because I think ignorance is probably the largest barrier. I think we just have to expose things and let people know that there's stuff out there for them.
Often military service members and first responders, their culture is one of stoicism, of pressing on and suffering in silence. And so they don't quite know how to understand it, how to get it treated. And so many of them will just suffer for months, sometimes years, before it finally reaches a point where it's affecting their job performance, it's affecting their marriage, and then hopefully they get the help they need.
The stigma is so strong in the departments, and that creates barriers to folks getting help. And unfortunately, when they don't get the help that they need, too many times it ends up in a suicide.
For anyone who's ever had the pleasure of working with a therapy dog, it's just a beautiful thing to bring them into an environment with people who may need just a little bit of love in that moment or a little bit of a break.
Dogs don't judge, so even in the toughest of times, she's there and she's constantly comforting.
There's been studies that show that therapy dogs help with depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms. It's just that calming effect that these animals have.
From blood pressure reduction to stress management to decompression to just giving people that room to breathe for a second.
We have that serotonin release, so that helps calm the individual and then helps them process the traumatic events a little bit easier.
So a lot of times I bring Sammy to work when I know I'm going to meet with an officer. Starts a conversation, they are immediately drawn to the dog, and then I can start asking questions while they're petting the dog and Sammy's giving some attention and some love to them.
So this is my therapy dog, Athena. We've taken her to the emergency room at the University Hospitals. We take her to critical incidents. We take her to any kind of trainings we have when we talk about PTSD.
When we got Aspen, we knew she had a natural instinct to just comfort everyone and anyone she met. She has this little lean that she does, and it's kind of like an extra hug, like you're squeezing a little bit tighter, and that's kind of her special way of saying, I understand and I'm here for you.
So once the dog comes and smiles at you and opens up their mouth and looks you in the eye, it's hard not to return a smile and just to feel calm. And that's what we're looking for. And that's why I think the beauty of animal-assisted therapy is.
It's the biggest issue we have right now is my brothers and sisters, they're killing themselves at a record rate.
Unfortunately, we've had 2 die by suicide in the last 2.5 years.
It's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and you leave behind your family and friends and coworkers, and they carry guilt, and that could be the thing that pushes your coworker over the edge.
Nobody truly wants to die. They just don't want to live with the current events that are going on in their head.
Death is not the answer. It transfers the pain.
A lot of us have looked at that pistol. A lot of us have had a terrible moment in our personal life and went, yeah, not today. A lot of us have been there. Most people won't admit it, though.
I met my breaking point, I would say several times. By 2012, after 12 years of service, I'd already given up on life. I'd given up on myself. I was an alcoholic. I'd isolated myself. I'd been divorced. I had my home foreclosed on.
I was towing the line of the breaking point. My Glock began to look tasty. Pills began to look tasty. I got very close to the breaking point and no one knew it.
And when you get to that point where you feel completely hopeless and you are a complete burden to everyone in your life and you have nowhere else to turn, you turn to the end of the road. And it is a very dark and terrifying place to be in.
The demons in my head started telling me that, you know, you're a failure, you're a bad mom, you can't even get your crap together for your kid, this is what you signed up for. I mean, just so much negativity in my brain that I felt like I was truly better off dead. And I started to plan my exit. I mean, I was very, very close to punching out.
When you're the first responder going through it, you don't know how bad you're getting. You don't know how far down that hole you've already gotten. And by the time you do, you feel like you're too far to get yourself out of it. You feel like it's too hard to reach out and ask somebody for help because you've gone so far down that hole by yourself that hope seems like a fake word.
When I was investigating human trafficking, we had a call that went sideways and a number of children were killed by their captor. And after the call, one of the officers committed suicide in the parking lot. He shot himself with his service weapon.
I went to my bedroom, I moved our dresser in front of the door. I went into our walk-in closet, closed the door, tied an extension cord around one of the rods, tied it around my neck and knelt down and just kind of let my body weight go. And I know that I was getting close to losing consciousness because things were starting to get fuzzy and kind of like a kind of like a drowsy effect. And my son somehow had gotten through the doors, and he got me cut down and went to the hospital.
I had convinced myself I needed to kill myself. And I sat down at my kitchen table, I had my duty gun there, and I was sitting there contemplating, do you write notes or not? And I looked up on the wall, and there's a family collage of pictures up there. And I told myself, you're not doing that to them.
And there was one pivotal moment where I sat with my service revolver in front of me for a long while. And contemplated leaving the planet, contemplated taking my life, because I didn't know how I could get past the trauma. I didn't know, I didn't have any hope.
I grabbed the firearm I carried off duty, my Glock 27, put it in my waist, and walked out our back door into some woods we have. I got the gun out and was staring at it, and had put it up to my head a couple times even. And my phone starts vibrating, so I look down to see who's calling, and it's my wife. So I pick it up, and she's like, "What are you doing? Are you gonna come back into the house?" And I didn't know what to tell her, so I said, "Yeah, I'm coming back in." And my thought then immediately was, well, I can't do it now. For some reason, it was worse, that she knew I'd walked out and I was gone, I was out there.
We had a jet tub in our house. I would sit in the jet tub with no water in it, and I would take my clothes off, except for my underwear, and I had my phone next to me and a bottle of alcohol, and I was drinking, and I was gonna call the dispatch center a town away from us and tell them I was killing myself. I didn't want our EMTs to show up. I would sit there and see how much pressure I could put on the trigger without it going off. I guess in hopes, I would just hope that maybe I would twitch enough to just go ahead and pull the trigger. I'd sit in a bathtub because I didn't want to make a mess for anybody, because I've been on death scenes that they get messy. I wanted to make sure all the blood was contained. I know this sounds sickening, but this is what was going through my mind. I didn't want to live anymore. Even though I had 3 kids, I didn't feel worthy to be the father. I didn't feel worthy to wear the badge. I didn't feel worthy to even be called a friend to somebody at this point in my life.
As a culture, if we don't continue to deal with this, if we don't continue to show support for those who need it, and changing the dialogue, the numbers will keep going up, and they are going up. Every year there's more suicides.
But unless someone is willing to like grab their junk, get a spine, and have that conversation, then they're gonna be paying for a lot more funerals, because it's just gonna keep happening. And it's not necessary, and it's not fair.
And I've seen too many people at that place. And as much as you want to reach in and you just want to pull them back and you just want to save them from the edge, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you lose people that just couldn't anymore. And it's sad because we can prevent it. We can do something about it from the beginning.
Having faith in a higher power is a legitimate treatment option for PTS.
Faith and spirituality can be a very good treatment option. Trauma changes the way we view life, but so can a spiritual encounter. And so I think that it's very effective. I think those who have experienced it, or they feel a certain amount of peace in studying scripture, that can be very effective.
So I would say my faith has played a very important role in my ability to deal with stress.
A human being is made of a body, spirit, soul. And if we're going to really help
someone with post-traumatic stress, we have to treat the whole person. We have to treat them physically, we have to treat them emotionally, and we have to treat them spiritually.
My spirituality has probably been the #1 healer for me, is accepting a higher power, trying to live a God-centered life, a life of service, so to speak.
For me, it was, I found God, I got saved, and I started to go to church.
He had a God moment, and that was really when he was transformed. I mean, almost in a day, I saw so much change in him.
In that going to church, I was developed relationships with healthy people. I got to just talk about it. And the more that I started to talk about it, I felt healing in talking, especially being around a safe place.
It really did change his whole outlook on his purpose and his life.
Just being in a community of people that understood me was probably the most valuable thing, and just trying to give hope to others.
I would definitely say that Daniel's faith saved his life.
We go out and we experience trauma in our 9-hour, 10-hour shift, and then we're expected to come home and be a dad, be a spouse. And sometimes that's hard to do when you just pulled a kid out of a car accident that's dead.
Post-traumatic stress tears families apart from the bottom to the top.
Obviously, you don't realize that it's affecting your family at the time because you're just in this bubble of self-absorption where you're just kind of medicating yourself and trying to numb yourself to everything that's going on.
PTSD or trauma in your marriage can crumble it. It can cause lots of issues. It can cause intimacy issues, trust issues. It can cause a distance, disconnection.
I think when your law enforcement spouse comes home with stress or PTSD, it does affect a marriage. I didn't always know how to communicate with him.
I felt like I was in survival mode for many, many, many years. Just the ups and the downs and confusion, what's going on.
Symptoms tend to present in kind of challenging ways. Irritability, anger, struggles sleeping at night. The spouse then has kind of a special role in making sure that the relationship is a safe space, a calm space, extra understanding, just being aware that they're just not able to show up as their best self, and it's not because they're choosing that, it's just because of what they're trying to heal from, what they went through, what they're going through still.
Years ago now, my wife would always tell me when I was going through what I was going through that we prefer when you're at work. And if that doesn't hit home, I don't know what will.
For us, it wasn't necessarily the trauma that was the direct result of our issues in marriage. It was the emotional walls and the emotional barriers that I put up to keep from being affected by the trauma. And so what made me a good officer or a good deputy, it made me a terrible husband.
Most people in the fire who are married in the fire service shelter their family from what they see every day because that's kind of what we do. Sometimes sharing that stuff with your family so that they understand what you're going through helps them understand why you're kind of being a jerk that day.
You know, I made a lot of mistakes, and one of the biggest mistakes was that I never talked about the job to my spouse at the time. And I had this belief that if I kept the job separate from my family, it would somehow protect them.
The trauma is what is creating the symptoms that you're seeing. It's not something that they're choosing on purpose. So giving them grace and space to just recognize that the hard things that are coming out, the difficult symptoms, are an opportunity for you to see that they need help even if they can't tell you that. And that's what's going to help them feel accepted and welcome, and that's what's going to make them feel encouraged to come back to you next time.
Later on in our marriage, we started figuring these things out. I would come home and I would tell her, had a bad day. Or, you know what, I don't want to talk about it right now because I don't want to relive it, or I'm still processing what happened. That was better for her to hear that, and the narrative didn't start in her head. And then I could come back to her later if I wanted to process it. But she didn't pry either. She didn't try to get it out of me.
It took me a while, but I have learned, do not do verbal diarrhea on your spouse when they come home. So let them get in the door, let them decompress, however that is, whether that's going and listening to some music, dropping all their gear, taking a shower, give them their 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever they need. It definitely helps to allow them to take the job off and then be present in your house. I know that there are really bad days and you can see it on their face. And the worst thing you can do is to ask them about it. Understand that they have to work through it. And if they want to talk about it, they'll tell you about it. If they don't, they won't. Trying to get it out of them is not the way to go.
Secondary PTSD is mostly what we're concerned about with our spouses. It's the fear that people have that if I talk about my experiences, that I'm going to traumatize the person that I'm talking to.
We realized that a lot of what I was doing and portraying and bringing home to my family, my wife was taking full force on because she was trying to deflect it so it wouldn't become an issue with our daughter. And it has now affected her to where now she's now seeing a therapist and getting treatment for what they are calling PTSD. And it is more than likely the secondary PTSD. It is a reflection of what she had to deal with because of me and what I was going through, which wasn't necessarily intentional, but it's still traumatic.
So we see a lot of divorces within the first responder community. And a lot of that does have to do with what we've seen and what we've experienced.
My marriage ended because of the behavior that I was exhibiting based on the symptoms of PTSD. And I refused to accept and take the care that was being offered to me.
And with children, they're naturally self-centered. They think it's about them. Even if you say it's not, they're going to think they did something wrong. And so unless we say, honey, it's not you. I just had a really hard day at work. Thank you so much for asking. Come here and give me a hug and it'll feel better. Right? So that honesty can actually be the best thing that we do and the healthiest things that we can do for our families and for ourselves.
PTSD is becoming more and more okay to talk about, and that's a good thing because I think people are going to be more willing to get help and people are going to be more willing to offer help.
Animal-assisted therapy, it's just so soothing, it's so calming, it's so healing, because it's really introspective. You get to learn a lot about yourself.
For me, being around horses is just therapy. It makes me happy, it's my happy place.
I think equine therapy is a wonderful alternative intervention for people who've been suffering with PTSD or complex PTSD. It helps cultivate regulation of the nervous system that can be very restorative.
Horses are very sensitive. They're very intuitive.
The horses will read the energy of the person around them. For me personally, horses call me out on not being present. Horses ask me to slow down to spend time with them.
The horses are the therapists here. They give them feedback on their behavior, on relationships, how they interact with others, and it's very powerful.
When you really connect with an animal and you see that animal as a living, breathing soul, I really think it does provide an extra layer of empathy and compassion and concern that you can bring out into the world as well and connect better with people.
When people are feeling better simply by being with the horses, they can interact differently in their families, they can interact differently at work, they can have different kinds of conversations based from a place of response rather than reaction.
It's just something that people are finally starting to discover is how wonderful these creatures are and actually what great therapists they are.
It helps us settle down, it helps us reconnect and reground and recenter ourselves so we can present a little bit more calmly And I love this quote, "Until one loves an animal, part of one's soul remains unawakened."
I just kind of had a moment of clarity, is what I call it, where I one day realized I'm going to die if I don't do something about this.
There's no way you can do what we do and see what we see without it changing you and affecting you, and you have to be aware of that.
You can't put it off, you can't fight it, you can't hide it. You have to get help.
If these issues are not addressed in a timely manner, repeatedly what we will see is officers will snowball. They will go downhill very quickly.
First and foremost, you got to admit you got the problems. You got to see the symptoms and signs in yourself. Then you got to have the courage to go get the help that you need, because the tools are out there. They are there.
The number one formal treatment for PTSD is talk therapy.
The first one is prolonged exposure. Prolonged exposure is a specific type of therapy to help expose somebody to the trauma and help them desensitize to it. Then there's what's called cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and it is more of a strategic weekly processing of the cognitions and the different images and the scenes that you have in your head.
Group therapy is helpful at addressing some aspects of PTSD, like the shame. So that if you're sitting in a room with a bunch of other first responders and they all are saying, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, you don't feel as isolated, you don't feel as stigmatized, you don't feel as ashamed.
Not every therapist is the same, so finding the one that you can relate to the best is imperative as well.
Therapists or counselors, they're kind of like shoes. Some fit, some don't, and some just really stink.
I think that it is important to find a clinician who is culturally competent, who understands the job, our lingo, our terminology, our shift schedule, our exposure.
It does take a specific kind of person to be able to deal with us. We are a different breed, and it takes a special person to be able to hear what we go through, because when we start talking about this stuff, we start talking about our worst calls. And that person has to be willing and able to hear that.
The other treatment that I finally decided to do is medication. I fought that from the very beginning, and oh my God, medication worked. It like shut off that loop in my head. It got me some sleep. It was transforming.
I think antidepressants and anxiolytic medications are good because they allow you to separate your emotions a little bit, to see what's going on, handle it, work on it. And then you can work on changing it, changing the medication, changing the dose, removing it, discontinuing it, whatever.
I don't like taking pills. I'm not a pill person. I didn't like being a zombie, because that's what it made me feel like, was that I was just walking around in a daze all the time, not feeling anything. And that didn't work for me.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, is arguably one of the most, if not the most, effective therapy for helping the brain and the body heal from trauma.
We use bilateral brain stimulation. I use a traditional rapid eye movement method that I facilitate with my hand.
Some therapists will use tones through headphones. Some therapists use a light bar.
There's also tapping, where people will tap on either leg or either shoulder. So there are many different ways to facilitate the stimulation.
Anytime I tell anybody to see a therapist, find somebody who does EMDR. It's crazy. I hate it, but it's crazy how well it works.
Peer support is an excellent avenue to take. You're surrounded by people that completely understand the diverse experiences that first responders have.
Peer supporters are trained to be a non-judgmental and confidential ear who understands what's happening, and to really normalize that for the person who's reaching out to them.
Peer support might be what works for you. or a coach or a consultant. There are many different layers of people out there who can help you.
We're starting to see more and more states across America give confidentiality rights to peer support teams. And that's imperative because we want our brothers and sisters to seek help. We want them to ask for help, to come to you for resources, or just maybe even to listen.
The number one side effect with PTSD is going to be your anxiety and your depression. Those two things we know have been shown in the research over and over again. Physical activity has a direct correlation. You increase physical activity, it changes the way our brain is operating, and we see reduction in depression, reduction in anxiety.
Exercising is probably one of the best ways to deal with stress. There are studies out there that show that regular exercise is just as good as an antidepressant, and sometimes even better.
And it doesn't have to be heavy cardio or running a marathon, it just needs to be moving. Finding that other activity to increase heart rate, to improve cardio performance. When we exercise, we get that same cortisol reaction that you get during a fight or flight situation. However, your body then learns how to use that cortisol appropriately when we're exercising.
Ketamine is one of the safest anesthetics around. What we're using in low-dose ketamine therapy is 1/10 of what's used for anesthesia in the hospital.
And so the ketamine allows the unconscious brain to surface, that allows them to bring up something that normally would be locked in the brain and inaccessible, and process it.
Ketamine has a second mechanism. It turns on a growth factor. That growth factor is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF drives brain repair. That then starts to undo all the damage that PTSD caused in the brain.
I've done pre-post brain mapping on people that have received ketamine, and I have seen significant improvement in their overall brain function within 24 hours.
We're seeing a lot of different studies, but some of them can show that you actually have a 70% reduction in depressive symptoms and an almost 40% reduction in suicidal ideation.
Last year, I wound up going to ketamine-assisted therapy, and I found that really brought up a lot of things that I thought I dealt with, but hadn't. And I'm sure they're still in there, obviously, but that was really a game changer for me.
Perfect.
Stellate ganglion block is a really exciting innovation for first responders.
PTSI is not just in your head. It is a biological change in the brain. It's physiologic, it's observable, and it's treatable using biological means.
Stellate ganglion block targets a cluster of nerves in the neck and reboots the adrenaline system by bringing calm back to the body. It's actually an anesthetic that's being injected.
When we do the block, it lasts about 8 to 12 hours. So it temporarily blocks norepinephrine secretion. So a shot that lasts 8 hours can last for years.
The procedure itself was very easy.
I really thought there was going to be some pain involved, and I was very pleased to feel a little pressure in my neck. It was fast. I don't think it took 15 minutes.
I would definitely recommend SGB to anyone dealing with PTS.
It's one of the most exciting innovations, particularly for first responders, because it's very effective and it's very efficient.
Thank you.
In functional counterstrain, we address inflammation. We work with a series of maps that are located on the head. Those maps tell us what part of the nervous system are affected, what structures are affected. There's about 40 different ones that we can feel restrictions that tell us to look for specific spots in the body. We work with some of the peripheral nerves, the nerves in the chest that control vasoconstriction or blood flow to the head, that control blood flow to the heart and the lungs.
Counterstrain was the only ones I felt instantly helped me with my PTSD symptoms that I had.
Counterstrain has saved my life, enhanced my life, gave me a little more purpose to life.
Counterstrain is one of the interventions that I think will be part of a comprehensive program of treatment for PTSD in the future.
give the brain what it needs to repair itself, and that's BDNF. Remember, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the factor that causes brain repair in the adult brain. You deliver that by giving them ketamine or by giving them multi-watt infrared light therapy. With the right wavelength and with enough power to get through the scalp and the skull and into the brain, we deliver that wavelength to the mitochondria, and that turns on a bunch of things. Number one, it increases activity of the mitochondria, so you get more energy. You also get something like nitric oxide that lives for about 2 seconds and has some very localized effect. But more importantly, the mitochondria send messages to the DNA saying, turn on these genes. Those are the genes responsible for making brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that growth factor that repairs the brain. It turns on anti-inflammatory chemicals that reduces the inflammation in the brain. It turns on chemicals that interrupts that glutamate storm. You know, so we've talked about there's 30 some odd chemicals that are turned on in the brain in PTSD. This is putting the brakes on a lot of that.
Once I started the treatment, I started getting my life back. It took time, it took several sessions, but I feel like myself again.
Here are a number of symptoms that we've seen with our patients. And so the red bars is before treatment. You see, almost all of our patients came in with depression and irritability and sleep issues. All of these get better.
The authentic intention of yoga is mastering the mind and creating an optimal functioning of the psychophysiological system, the mind, body, and nervous system. It allows an actual physiological and mental and neurological change to happen. It can truly accompany those other modalities. The intention is to practice yoga. The action is the yoga postures themselves, but then we have to have an awareness about how we're doing the yoga. That's where the breath comes in. That's where the precision of movement comes in. That's where the repetition of mental messages comes in. All of it is training to keep your mind on the yoga mat, and then you're not thinking about that call.
I feel like all of the yoga is to get to that neural reset part, and to have that calmness to help process the stress has been very rewarding for me.
Integral breath work is one of the most powerful, most gentle way to heal trauma.
Integral breath work has made a humongous difference in my life. It's probably the most significant form of therapy that I've ever done for my trauma.
We lay the patient on the mat and we ask them to breathe in a very specific way. It's connecting the in-breath with the out-breath in a circular motion. And in doing that, that relaxes the body enough where the patient goes into a non-ordinary state of consciousness.
What you're actually helping the body to do is to open up some of those gateways to be able to process and to experience painful memories, traumas, or even repressed memories that you otherwise wouldn't even have remembered.
It's a natural way of healing. It doesn't involve any other drugs. It doesn't involve anything outside of itself.
Singing bowls come in all different sizes, prices, tones, and types. The singing bowls speak the language of the brain, which is frequency, taking the mind from busy beta brainwaves into the meditative alpha-theta state. This is key for someone with PTSD because inducing a meditative state of mind leads to balanced brainwaves and improved mental and physical health. In addition, the singing bowls produce vibration, and since the human body is primarily water, these vibrations travel through the body, sinking deep into the bones and the muscles and the organs. Physiologically, the bowl will help reactivate your parasympathetic nervous system and the self-healing abilities of your body. With a calm mind and relaxed body, you will have the perfect conditions to access self-healing anytime or anywhere.
I think one of the most exciting things is that we're on the forefront of the model of treatment shifting in a really fundamental way. I think psychologists are now starting to see the benefit of teaming up with providers that give stellate ganglion block, ketamine, other powerful biological treatments, and using that in combination with trauma-focused talk therapy is going to get people amazing outcomes.
I think years ago, all we had was talk therapy and medications. Now we have so many other modalities available to us, and these modalities are being researched, are being backed by evidence. I think that it's time to take advantage of these other tools. Let's create a treatment plan, a wellness plan that works for each individual.
We are able to connect people to different methods, different facilities, different types of therapies, different types of groups. You don't have to stay stuck in silence like this anymore. And it's incredible to see where we're at now.
It's really important for people to understand that they can grow through trauma, and that by getting the right treatment and the right support, they can become stronger than they ever were before.
You might have to work for it, but find what works for you. I got better. I still have work to do, for sure. Like, I still have a lot of work, but you can get better.
I, to this day, remember so many of my calls. I can remember the trauma. I can smell. I can hear the sounds. Even though it's been 16 years since I've worked in actual trauma, I can still to this day very clearly see those people and who I helped, and even those that we lost.
There's times that you're gonna think about the officers that I lost, or that the child that I lost, or whatever that call was.
You go back and you relive them, and you think about them, and you sleep and you wake up thinking about them and dreaming about them. There's a lot of triggers involved when it comes to PTS.
You think you might have forgot what the call was, and something will trigger it. We work on trying to get that out of our heads after it happens, and sometimes it's different. Sometimes it may last 5 or 10 minutes, and sometimes I'll come home and get in the fetal position in my bed and just cry. That's all I can do.
Sometimes you think you have it all under control, and then it's just like this residual stuff that just hangs in the back of there, and it's just there. It's always there.
I've had so many experiences with the residual side of PTS. It's not something that's ever going to leave completely. The only thing that we can do is be exposed to the tools to help us get through it.
It's residual in the fact that it's always there, but I have more tools to handle it and work on it. When I get a little triggered by something, whatever, I now can deal with it a lot differently than I would have before.
So I truly believe that you can recover and heal from post-traumatic stress injury. But the facts are that residual symptoms will be with you for the rest of your life. The key is knowing how to address them. That's the true difference.
We don't like to get in other people's business. You know, we want to try and keep to ourselves, and it's not really our problem. We don't want to pry. But I think that's the key to changing this number of suicides that happen per year, is that when you see something change in an officer's life, to step in and offer some support.
First responders, man, we got to watch out for each other. We're peers. We're the ones that know. We see each other every day. We go to these calls with each other. We have to be keeping an eye on each other. We have to.
When we see something going on in our brothers and sisters' lives, don't be afraid to challenge with compassion and talk to them.
We need to truly care about each other. And that means knowing each other and stepping in and standing up when we need to. We're not doing that, and we need to do a better job.
It's imperative that departments start to focus on wellness and start to teach their officers about FMLA and treatment centers. There's not enough discussed, then or now. It needs some exposure. Officer wellness needs more exposure.
We have a problem in that we're not proactive enough. We're very reactionary with everything. And we could do so much more to get out ahead of these things before they happen.
The key
to a long-term career as a responder is very early mental health treatment. Very early, before you even notice symptoms. You should be getting preventative care, just like the dentist, just like your blood work. We should be doing preventative mental health care for responders because we know they are exposed to PTSD-inducing incidents almost every shift.
It is very important that responders have a relationship with their peer supporters before the critical incident. It is important that responders have a relationship with somebody who is in the mental health professions before they need them in a crisis situation. That's not the time to establish trust and rapport. You really want to establish that prior, when life is going seemingly well, when it's a regular routine day, so that that foundation of that relationship is built before you actually need it.
People will look at me and say, "You have PTSD?" You know, I say, "Yes. Is there something wrong?" And they say, "Well, you just look like you have it all together." Well, what people need to understand is this is a face of PTSD.
Smashing the stigma is about eliminating this barrier that we're discussing around the fear of being sidelined or treated differently or seen differently by the people that you love and respect that you serve with.
We need to end the stigma, not just lessen it, but end the stigma surrounding it. And that there shouldn't be a fear to say, I have PTSD or PTSI.
And we need to change the culture. We need to start in the police academies, and we need to carry that on at every single level of leadership in our agencies.
We're failing our officers. We're failing our officers, and we're failing our officers' families. And we're failing them across the board because we're not training them, and we're not making them aware, and we're not giving them the tools to be successful.
It's more than just having an employee assistance program and a peer support team. We need to have education in our academies. We need to educate the family members.
If we have these conversations early in their career, maybe, just maybe, something we say sticks and lands with them, and they realize when that time comes, because it's coming in life or on this job, the accumulation of stress and trauma, that they know they have people to reach out to that care.
Everyone watching this film has a story. The power is that if we all share our stories, we can all truly make a difference. And I've already seen it starting, but we have to carry this torch on. We need to continue it. But things are changing, things are getting better. And I know for a fact we are saving lives every single day.
This career is hard enough. Do not let it diminish you. Reach out, ask for help, say yes to support. Do not let this end your life.
There is help out there. It is okay to reach out. It is okay to say, I'm not okay.
I'd like to say if there's anybody out there that needs help with this, to please get it. I don't want to see anybody hurt or suffer the pain that I've gone through, and God forbid somebody take their life from something terrible like PTSD.
But I am very hopeful that the more we talk about it, the more we can prevent suicides.
You are seeing things being more accepted. You are seeing more people talking about it. You are seeing the salty veterans being more accepted to a change in this because they're seeing their friends and their coworkers kill themselves.
There's nonprofits, there are programs. A lot of agencies now have peer support programs. They have people that are trained within their agency to help officers.
There's lots of resources out there. You can't wait until you're at the breaking point.
There is something called post-traumatic growth, where we can grow from what we learned in the past. And these traumatic events don't always have to drag us down. They may change our life forever, but we can grow after these traumatic events.
The future looks very promising, and yet we're still learning so much more. Moral injury will be the next new term that we'll be looking at in the fire service and the EMS world. These are all positive. We're seeing more and more of our brothers and sisters stand up and say, hey, I need some help.
I know you think you're alone and you're suffering in silence. And the fact is, I waited far too long. I waited 4 years of suffering in silence, ashamed, embarrassed. thinking there was no one out there that would understand it, no one out there that would be able to help me. But I'm living proof that you can get better. I have a whole new life now, and you can too. And all you have to do is raise your hand and ask for help.
We have a term that we use in law enforcement, tombstone courage. It usually is used in regards to when you go on a call that you should wait for backup. Don't go running in by yourself, right? You see a fight, don't jump in by yourself until you've got backup available. They call it tombstone courage. Or you go into something alone. You're gonna have the hero situation, right? I'm gonna go do this myself. I look at it as tombstone courage if you don't get help when you're suffering from PTS. It's tombstone courage because ultimately, one of two things is going to die. It's either going to be you or it's going to be your career. You don't get the help you need. So ditch the tombstone courage. Forget about the perceptions of other people. Step up, be courageous, recognize your human self, and go get the help that you need. The tools are there. If you really want to have joy and you really want to have happiness in your life, then you need to find a way to get the tools that you need to have a joyous and happy life. You can't ignore the problem. It will not get better without help.